Okey doke, we got it. Great. Turn it off. Super duper. I hate that. I get to hear it's like an echo. Hello, everybody. Good evening. Happy spring. Nice to see everyone, even though I've turned off all your videos. I know you're there. I see your names. I'm Lucy Helfrich, Director of Program Services for the 300 Committee Land Trust in Falmouth. We're delighted to have Mike Tucker here with us again tonight on a special program about bird photography. Quickly, the 300 Committee is grateful to all of you who support our work to save open space in Falmouth. We're on our 37th year of permanently protecting land in all 7 of Falmouth's villages. Your membership support underwrites the day-to-day work of permanently protecting high priority lands. Every parcel presented to us is screened and ranked using criteria like critical habitat, drinking water protection, linkage to existing open space, proximity to water resources and wetlands, potential for trails, and more. Our land acquisition committee meets monthly. We just had a meeting this afternoon. Our members of the LAC conduct site visits to many of these parcels to get a feel for them. LAC recommendations to pursue acquisition are then brought to the 300 Committee's Board of Directors for a vote. As you are no doubt aware, land in Falmouth is becoming more scarce and more expensive, so we face increasing challenges. Your membership enables us to continue our important work, and if you're not yet a member, we do hope you will join us. Tonight, we have Mike Tucker with us, and most of you know Mike Tucker, so I'm going to skip some of the formalities, but I do want to let you know that he has extraordinary experience and knowledge with birds and loves to share all of that with us. We're very lucky for that. Keep an eye in your inboxes for news of his spring migration walk series called Migration Mondays. Those will be starting Monday, April 25th and going, I think, for 5 consecutive weeks, early in the morning, 7 a.m. And we'll let you know where. Hopefully you can join Mike for one or more of those wonderful bird walks. Today, Mike's talking, like I said, about photographing birds. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to Mike.
All right, thanks, Lucy. This is a new program for me. In the past, I've done a lot of programs about more workshop sort of things, especially when I was with Audubon, and it would involve 3 days of going over, so many different functions of the camera and whatnot. And so with this one, we're going to touch on some of that stuff. And instead of going crazy technical, we're going to look at a lot of photos. And as we look through the photos, I'll talk a little bit about the sort of things I consider and the sort of steps I took to make that photo happen. I started at a really young age. I got my first 35 millimeter when I was 12 years old. And excuse me, I basically been doing photography ever since. And even as a young age, I was just determined to really understand it and make a science out of it. Like I wasn't happy just putting a camera in auto mode and pointing and shooting. I wanted to know how it worked and what are some of the things I can do to control the image. What kind of creative control can I have over it? And those are sort of the things we're going to talk about here today. So there's not going to be a whole lot of things to read in this, but the first few slides or so, I'm going to talk about a few different things. And hold on, I need to learn how to get rid of something off my computer here. There we go. So the basic camera functions and, how that pertains to photographing birds. The one thing, that a camera is you're always looking to do is to get that proper exposure. And what I call the exposure relationship is how a lot of these things work together. The shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. And I will talk a little bit more about that. The ISO meaning sort of like the olden days of film speed. The nice part about digital cameras today, they made it pretty practical to make the switch from film to digital because a lot of these relationships are the same. The shutter speed, the aperture, the effective ISO. Of course, it's not film anymore, but it's all about how sensitive it is to light. We'll talk more about that. Metering system. Next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about that. There are a few different kinds out there, and shooting modes. I will mostly be talking about a couple of these, but in addition to manual, shutter priority, and aperture priority, there are often a lot of different auto modes, or so-called scene modes. A lot of pro cameras won't have those, but some of the middle of the road ones will. They might have one where you just click it to, scenic, and another one you click the portraits and those sort of things. And all that's doing is favoring a certain combination, going back to that exposure relationship, because we'll talk a little bit about what it means to have different apertures and shutter speeds and how that affects the photo. In the field tips and adjustments, with bird photography, there's always tricky lighting situations. It's beautiful when you get a situation where you just don't have to do much thinking and you can point and shoot. Although even pointing and shooting, you're usually thinking ahead of time. You're already going off on the trail with your camera set to certain conditions that you're going to expect. And we'll get more into that. And we'll talk about depth of field a little bit and how that can be important even in bird photography, how motion is captured. So whether it's a flying bird or a sitting bird, whether you want those wings blurred or you want them captured. We'll talk about those. And composition in the field, sometimes you need to think about, but you'll also notice I mentioned that in process and tips as well, because sometimes, actually quite often, when you're getting a photo of a bird, you're focusing maybe on the center part of your viewfinder and you're snapping that picture, but unfortunately, rarely are you close enough to be to that bird where there isn't going to be cropping involved. So compensation considerations can involve how you crop it once you're processing it on your computer, where do you want to move that around, what's important, what do you want to avoid, are there certain distracting elements in the photo, those sort of things. And then the basic adjustments, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we get into those. Now, real quick on this, I don't want to spend a ton of time on this, but shutter speed is just that. It's how long that shutter is open to make an exposure. I just threw a few examples up there. There are many more than this, 2/50th of a second, 500th, 1000th. I hear somebody moving and talking. If they could just mute themselves, please. For bird photography, most of those shutter speeds are going to be at least 500th of a second, 1000th, sometimes more. And in certain situations, it'll be less when you're just trying to get the most out of the scene. And I'll explain that in a little while as well. Again, the shutter, has a lot to do with how motion is captured. And aperture is what really determines the depth of field, but it's also, think of it as just the opening. 5.6 is a wider opening than f11. And the characteristics that you get in your photo from changing those apertures is where you see depth of field change in the photo as well. So, there's some really interesting ways you can use that in bird photography, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And again, ISO, I already touched on it a little bit, but think of it as how sensitive it is to light. So 100 compared to 1000, for example, on a really bright day, you can probably get away with shooting at an ISO of 100. When it's not quite as bright, you need the camera to be more sensitive to light, then you change it to something like 1000. Now it's more sensitive, and you can get the proper exposure with a higher ISO. But the trade-off is the higher the ISO, the more grain you get in your photo. So sometimes they look a little muddy if it gets too high. And that comes into play when you're cropping in after, because you want a nice clean image. So cropping in after the fact, sometimes you can't do it a whole lot if that ISO is too high. So I'll talk about some ways to get around that a little bit. And also all of these are determined with the help of your camera meter. Now I use a Nikon D500. So there are three different sorts of metering choices within the D500. The matrix is a very sophisticated system where it looks at the whole scene and it actually kind of compares it to other scenes. It's like has a database of kind of what it thinks that scene should look like. And it takes into consideration where the focus point is in the scene based on the information the camera lens is giving it. And so it looks at everything. Now, for bird photography, I generally use center weighted metering because most of the information, I forget with Nikon if it's 75 or 80%, is in a smaller circle in the center. So in other words, the bird's the most important thing to me. In determining proper exposure on the bird, I care more about that than the surrounding area. So that's why I use center weighted metering. And spot metering, on scale wise, that spot you see in the picture there would actually be quite smaller than that. So it looks at a very, very specific part of the scene. I don't like using that for bird photography because one shift to the left or the right could be on the white part of the bird or the dark part of the bird. And if you're using something like aperture priority or auto ISO, which I'll explain in a little bit, it can kind of completely change the look of the photo. So it's something that it has its applications, but I don't think its best application is with bird photography. Again, how the meter is reading the scene determines on what the camera thinks it should do. And I'm just going to back up a little bit here. Example, if you are shooting in, actually we'll stay here. If you're shooting in what's called aperture priority, it means you are selecting the aperture. For that given scene, you may say, okay, I'm going to pick 5.6. In aperture priority, based on what the meter is seeing and the ISO information it has with how light sensitive it is, it's saying, okay, for f5.6, you have to take this picture at 500th of a second, and that's what we will do for you. So that's what aperture priority is. You select the aperture and it selects the shutter speed in order to achieve what the camera believes is the proper exposure, that combination. So, and the same is true if you're doing shutter priority. If you picked for that same exact scene, 500th of a second, the camera will choose the aperture, given the scene it is looking at in the ISO, the same situation, it'll say 5.6. So there's really no difference there. You're just getting there a different way. Hopefully that makes sense. But again, we won't get too technical here. Now, I know this kind of first glance, oh my God, my head's spinning. Trust me, this is the last one that we're going to be looking at numbers and arrows and charts and all that stuff. But I'm just going to walk you through a couple of simple things here. This scale we see of f-stops up top, 2.8 to 32. And then down below, we see a scale of shutter speed from 1/4 of a second up to a 500th of a second. Now, there's a lot in between. What I have represented there are what are called full stops. So let's say, for example, we're looking at a given scene, and for that given scene, whether you're in aperture priority or shutter priority, the combination calls for f4, and if you follow that down for this first example, a 64th of a second. Okay, now you are in control of changing some different aspects of that photo. Without changing the exposure, you can change how motion is rendered, you can change how depth of field is shown in the photo. So if you went to f16, that would mean now it's a smaller opening, so the shutter has to be open longer. And that's a full 4 stops over smaller, so a full 4 stops slower is 1/4 of a second. So it's kind of, there's always that connection. And so that kind of applies a little bit as we'll talk about a few things. I'll give you an idea on the sort of shutter speeds on some of them that I use and some of the trade-offs that I might try to pull off a shot. Because one of the goals that I have is always to be able to try to get a print-worthy shot if I can. And again, if it means a high ISO shot, it can look grainy, and I want to avoid that. I have people ask me all the time this sort of flat question: what settings do you use for bird photography? Well, as you'll see going through this, there really is no one answer. I approach bird photography from a very technical aspect. In fact, I usually kind of scoff at the idea when some people say, oh, wow, you know, you know, you're a real artist with your bird photography, and I don't like that title, because to me the birds, the art is all in the birds, and to me it's a technical achievement to try to capture the art that is the bird. Granted, there is some artistic sort of influence you can have on certain photos with processing and cropping and those sort of things, but it's really all about the bird. Let's see. I was just hoping I could use my arrow, but I got to go to my mouse wheel again here. So this is me hunkered down in some grass at Crane Wildlife Refuge. Now, I say sacrifice yourself, because trust me, pulling off some of these photos, if you're going to really try getting into bird photography, you will get ticks on you. You will get wet. You will be lying in the sand with mud on your belly. You know, I've been in the woods before, and there's been like kind of a vernal pool sort of edge, marshy wetland sort of thing. And I want to get a certain photo and I just don't have a good angle at it. Well, I don't have my boots with me, but I guess I'm going to have to hose off my sneakers when I get home, because I'm going to go in to get that shot if I think it's worth it. You know, so I sacrifice myself a little bit once in a while, and you definitely need to think about tick protection, that's for sure. During the show, I don't really get into the gear a whole lot, but what you can see here is my Nikon 200 to 500 lens, and that's a 5.6 aperture all the way through. So at 200 millimeters, it's 5.6. At 500 millimeters, it's 5.6 for its widest opening, and then I could change it to whatever I like. And I use a D500 body. So it's a nice setup, but boy, technology is moving fast. And, you know, a couple of years ago, this was the camera to have for birds. Now everybody's talking about some, you know, mirrorless ones now, and they're lighter weight and they're fantastic. And it's always changing, but I'm not one to keep switching. I'll stick with what I have and get many more miles out of it. So the way we're going to do this, we're going to look at a lot of different photos, and some of the things I talked about, I'll show you how it applies here. And these first couple of shots are a good example to really get into it a little bit here. So some interesting things going on here. If you look at the bird on the left, this is a ruby-throated hummingbird, of course. These were in my yard, taken from different vantage points. Now, the one on the left had just as much light on the background as it did on the bird, and I didn't have to worry about compensating. Now, compensating isn't something we talked about yet. So what I do is I use what's called auto ISO. So I talked about aperture priority and I talked about shutter priority a little bit. With manual, you're selecting both, but you kind of have to have a good understanding of sort of where it needs to be as a starting point. So in this situation, I might choose f8 because it's a really optimal f-stop for my camera that gives good sharpness throughout and decent depth of field. If the bird is facing me, chances are its bill will be in focus and its eyeball will as well. Or believe it or not, if I shot that same photo at 5.6 from that angle and I was close and it was focused on the bill, the eyeball wouldn't be focused. So f8, when I'm really close to birds, gives me good depth of field. The closer you are, the more shallow the depth gets. So that's an important consideration for me. So no compensation with this photo on the left. But when I shifted around to another angle, I was kind of like sitting in a chair near my hummingbird feeders. The background was these dark rhododendron with a lot of dark shadows between the leaves. And if I had left my settings where they were, it would have been a washed out photo, because again, going back to what I said earlier, the camera will choose a setting to what it thinks is proper exposure. So if I'm shooting in auto ISO and I keep it at f8 and 1,000th of a second, that first photo you see on the left, because it's nice and bright, the ISO might be 400, let's say. So that gives me the ability to crop in. It's not too high, it's not going to get too grainy. But if we look at this photo on the right, if I'm going to keep those same settings, and I did, I'm also going to underexpose it because the camera is going to think that scene is too dark. Keep in mind that this photo is cropped in, so the bird takes in a small amount of the original frame, and there's a lot of blackness behind it. So the camera says, whoa, it's not supposed to be that black. We need to brighten this up. And I'll show you what that looks like next. So I intentionally underexposed with a dark background because I don't want the camera to compensate for it, bring it to where it thinks it needs to be. And when I do that in manual and auto ISO, it's going to switch the ISO. So it's going to move it from a high sensitive number where the camera thinks it probably has to be an ISO of 800 or 1000 for the shot. I'm going to say, nope, I'm going to drop that ISO down, and I'm doing it by simply using my compensation dial, by underexposing it. The camera will automatically drop that ISO lower to what it thinks it needs to be, less light sensitive, therefore a darker picture that's more accurate with the background and the light on the bird. We won't stay that technical. So here's a case on the left on what it probably would have looked like if I made no compensation, because it's saying that's a dark background, we need to brighten up the entire image. But unfortunately, you can't just brighten up the background. The entire image will be brighter based on what the camera thinks it needs for proper exposure, because again, the hummingbird is a small part of the picture and there's a whole lot of darkness in the background. So on the right represents me intentionally underexposing that image to bring back more clarity, more richness. You can see the top of the head of the hummingbird on the left is a little washed out. There's less detail there. The white area under the throat and below the neck is a little washed out, and you lose feather detail there. So it's, you know, I always think that way when I'm taking photos, and it takes time for everything to be second nature. But when I look at a bird or a scene, or I'm walking into an area, it's like I just kind of automatically think, you know, how is my camera going to read this scene, and do I need to compensate? So we'll talk a lot about those as we go along. We'll see different examples of that. So here's a situation where this tricolored heron was over at South Cape Beach. I heard about it. Actually, no, this one was around Falmouth, but I went over to South Cape Beach and ended up finding it over there. So that was exciting. So this guy here just kind of put on a show, and he's preening here with its wing out. Now, even though that's the water, it kind of acts like the sky because it's just as bright as the sky. And again, with this one, this is a cropped in image. So different from the hummingbird, the overwhelming amount of backgrounds and portion of the photo was this bright kind of whitish, gleamy sort of color. Now, we talked about what the camera did when it saw a dark background. When it sees that, it's like, oh, okay, this is bright. We're going to fix this for you. And we're going to, you know, darken this up a little bit. And I know the camera is going to do that. When I'm snapping these photos, I intentionally, after a couple of them, I did some for what it called for, but then I switched it to overexposing. And, you know, you could see another shot here, same bird. The bird is exposed nicely. And the background, you know, you could just see that shimmer in the water. It's almost as if it's like floating in an overcast sky, you know, and that's basically what the water looked like. If you ever try shooting birds flying in an overcast sky, you know you're going to get silhouettes unless you use compensation to fix that. Now, a lot of people will try to fix everything in Lightroom. And let's say I took this picture without compensating at all. I end up with just this dark silhouette of this tricolored heron sitting in the water. Yes, you can open up Lightroom and you can brighten up what's called the shadow areas, and all of a sudden everything that's a silhouette will start brightening up. The problem is when it's really dark there, that means that originally there's not a lot of detail there. So when you do that, the end result is not going to be as sharp as nailing the exposure the first time when you're in the field. And that's what I always stress. Try to avoid the urge of just pointing and shooting with whatever the camera thinks and then just fixing it in Lightroom. Sometimes it works if it's not a major adjustment, but in this case it would have been, and it would not have been a good picture. The feather detail would not be there. In the next photo, you can see the bird on the left. That basically is like without compensation there. So you overexpose a little bit to bring in the details you see in the feathers, to see the color on the left part of the bird there and the wing, and you know, everything, the color on the face, it just kind of comes into play a little bit more. And then if you are at least close with your settings with how you compensated it for, you can further tweak it in Lightroom, but you just don't want to have to try to recover a photo completely. So it's really important to at least try to get close to the proper exposure on the bird. And that's where, you know, you always have to think sort of and understand where your camera makes good decisions and where it doesn't, where it can be fooled. And a lot of it has to do with how big the subject is in the frame and what's the overwhelming background behind it. So this kingfisher was over by my house at Nobsca Pond. This is actually fairly heavily cropped, and I was able to get away with that. It was sitting still. One thing I haven't talked about yet is if I'm shooting in auto ISO, so in other words, I'm selecting manually the shutter speed and I'm manually selecting the aperture. For a bird like this that was sitting far away and a very dark background, this is cropped in, but the entire background was just trees that were in shade, but the sun was on the bird. So I knew what would happen if I didn't compensate. So I knew I had to underexpose it because of that dark background. It was going to try to brighten up everything for me. But not only did I want to underexpose, I wanted to drop my aperture down as low as I could, or as wide open as I can, I should say. And that would be 5.6 on my lens, rather than a lot of the songbird photography on the trail might be f8. So by doing that, I know I'm going to have to crop in a lot on this photo. I am bringing that ISO number lower and lower. I could have shot this at f8 and got the same exact exposure. The end result could have been, I don't know what it was. It could have been, let's say, 3200 ISO. Okay, well, you know, you're only going to be able to crop in so far before you see a lot of grain. So instead, what I did was make it wide open at 5.6 and also drop the shutter speed down to something I normally wouldn't do. And that could be 2/50th of a second or 3/20th of a second, instead of typically shooting at 800 or 1000. So the combination of dropping my shutter speed down low brings the ISO even lower. 5.6 wide open brings it even lower. So that combination can help you achieve a lower ISO, therefore crop in tighter. And so that's what I do. I try to get the low ISO I can for crop power, especially on a distant bird like this. And I kind of picked a happy medium there, and it worked out pretty well. What you can see here is what it would look like if I didn't compensate. Very dark background, and you've probably seen this before yourself. You know, you've probably seen a cool bird sitting up on a telephone wire, and you got a bright sky behind it, and you get a silhouette. Well, the opposite happens if there's a black background and the bird is lit nicely. You know, it's going to say that dark background, we're going to fix that for you. But unfortunately, the white parts of this bird get blown out. And trying to fix a photo like this in Lightroom would be difficult because the white in that neck area is so blown out, the details are already lost. So it can be really tricky to get the right thing. So sometimes you got to mess around a little bit too and try different settings, different compensation. Now, this bird here, I think this is a good example of what today's cameras can do, especially when you see what the original photo looks like. Now, at first, I didn't think I'd really be able to do much with this photo when I saw it on the back of my camera. But when I put it on my computer, I was like, whoa, okay. There was a bright sky behind it. So that meant the camera, because I didn't make any adjustments when I held my camera up to photograph this bird. Before I photographed this bird, I was photographing a brown creeper on some trees. So it really wasn't set for backlit bird photography sitting up on a branch against a bright sky. So it says, whoa, this is too bright, and it darkened it up. So the ISO, because of that bright sky, was like, wow, you know, we got all the light we need here, and it dropped the ISO way down based on the manual settings I had, and it ended up being 160. That's a very low ISO. I could probably even crop in tighter and maintain the detail on that face and eye. Which is, by the way, always what I go for. It's getting that eye sharp is key, because that's what your eye goes for usually when you're looking at a bird photo. So that low ISO resulted in that shot I just showed you being able to work with it. So this is a screenshot of my Lightroom before I worked on this photo at all. So you could see the bird is much darker. It doesn't have the detail in the face. And you also kind of get an idea what's going on around the bird. I don't usually do vertical crops for birds like you just saw. I usually do more of a horizontal crop. And I like the bird, if its head is pointing to the right, I like the bird to be sort of on the left of center in the photo. And if I did that, the tree would have been in the photo. And you know, it had this dark line going down in the photo, and then the bird looking at that dark line. I just didn't like composition-wise how that looked. So I was wondering, well, geez, can I crop in tight enough to get that tree out of that photo completely And because that ISO was so low, it really maintains clarity and sharpness. I was able to do that. And you can see the difference next to it here. That's a pretty tight crop on that bird. And that was because the ISO was so low. That's why I always strive for that, because you can do so much more with a photo if you can figure out how to compensate. This is a situation where people might set their own ISO to, like, 400 or 1,000. That way, you won't have any problems. And if you don't compensate and you take that picture with a high ISO, it's not going to look that. You will not have the ability to crop in like that. So it helps to be able to kind of understand some of the properties with a low ISO, how to achieve that. And this is a good example of the sort of crop power you can have, and pulling out the details. I lost no details in this bird at all, and even crop it in that much. So it's nice when you can be able to kind of pull those off. So here's a Lightroom shot where I cropped in a little bit tighter. You can see right below in the white box of what the actual size of the image is uncropped. If you look closely, it's kind of very grainy in the background, a little muddy looking, if you will. The bill and the face isn't really that sharp. Some of the sharpness isn't there. So I use Lightroom, but in this situation, I also use a program called Topaz, and it's a denoise program. This was a very dark day. It was, and I don't, I mean, it was actually dark out. It was overcast. It was drizzling at times. It might have even been a little drizzle in the air at this time. So there wasn't a lot of natural light there. In order to take this photo, whatever settings I chose, I can't remember, it might have been 7.1 or 6.3. I don't think it was f8 because I knew it was dark. I was trying to keep that ISO as low as I can. The shutter speed was probably 6/40th of a second, somewhere in that neighborhood, where as long as the bird's not moving fast, I should be able to get a sharp one. But that's what it looked like before I used the denoise program. And on the left here, you see the photo we just looked at. And on the right, you could see it has cleaner lines, it's sharper, and it's basically the end result of using this Topaz. And you could see some of the adjustments I did over here on the right. I increased the shadows a little bit and I decreased the black area. So kind of gave it a little bit more contrast, detail around the face. You can see the detail on the bill more, and the background doesn't look as noisy. And to get the full effect, this is what it is after using the Topaz and editing it in Lightroom. So sometimes there's a little bit of work involved, and these shots were important enough to me where I just wanted to make it look natural and nice. And so my settings came into play on my camera a little bit, but I had to take it a step further to kind of clean up the noise in the background a little bit, sharpen up the edges, and brighten up some of the detail areas where you can see the bill and the color in the face much better this way. I don't know if some of you might be saying, geez, all I ever do is just point and shoot my camera. I'll never remember all this. But a lot of these principles I'm talking about are easier than you think. And if you start off with something like aperture priority or shutter priority, and you experiment a little bit, and you experiment with exposure compensation, which almost every camera has, you'll see how some of the properties within that photo change a little bit, and you can learn a lot doing that. So since I just showed you a Topaz altered image, here's another one. And in the olden days, even the olden days of digital, when I had my first Nikon D200 body, if I shot at an ISO of 400, which is nothing with the sensors these days, it would start to look a little grainy, and it was tough. And the old days of film, if you bought like 1,000 ISO film speed, slide film or whatever, and you wanted to crop in a lot, you're going to see grain. There's no two ways about it. And usually with the higher ISO with film, it also meant less color saturation and less contrast. So it was just a flatter image. Now here, this was taken on the Christmas bird count in Tiverton, Rhode Island this past winter. It was a very dark area with a dark winter day underneath a heavy canopy of trees, which you would never know with the shot because you just don't get that vibe. The trick is trying to get the exposure proper the first time. Even though I had the right exposure, the ISO was 5600. That's unheard of to even try to get a print of in the olden days. But with this Topaz, it was sharp. You could see it was sharp, but it was just grainy, and it just cleans up the grain and maintains the sharpness. It's like magic. It's like poof, you know. And I ended up with a decent winter wren photo that I could have never pulled off years ago. So it's, you know, technology comes a long ways, but knowing how to use that technology and get the most out of it is key. If you're going to use Topaz to clean up noise in a photo, you want to make sure you're very close with the exposure, because if there's a dark area or a bright area, it's going to make the photo look really funky. It's just not going to come out well. You know, so not everything can be fixed. A lot of it you can come close, but it still goes back to the fundamentals of knowing how to use your camera and knowing how to read the scene and what settings to use for a good exposure. So I threw this one in here to talk about know your limitations. This is a blackneck stilt. This was a rarity for Cape Cod last year. I heard about it and I raced over to Sandy Neck and saw it out in the marsh there and managed to get some photos. I was happy with this. This is cropped in quite a bit, but sometimes, you know, you're not going to get that frame filling shot of a bird, because if I was going to try to pull that off with this, it was a dark day, I was not going to get good results. And I'll give you an example right here. And that's what happens if you really try to crop in too far and it's just simply too far away. You just can't always pull it off. I see this a lot on Facebook and all other social media, Instagram, where somehow they think it's better because the bird is much bigger in the photo, but I will take this more clear shot any day over that. And I don't mind the sort of habitat scene. I think it really adds to the photo. And again, just kind of, this is an extreme example, but cropping in tight isn't always the answer with birds. You know, sometimes you just don't have the information in the photo to pull it off. Whoop, sorry, this is why I hate using my wheel here. So it's too sensitive. Here we go. Another tricky situation you come across are shooting birds with a lot of white. And white and black combination on birds can be really tricky too. Now, one thing I almost automatically do if I'm going to shoot something like a snowy egret on the right, I'm always afraid that whatever the background is, it's going to think, if it's dark water in the background, it's going to have to lighten it up a little bit, which means anything white on that bird will be completely lost in details. It'll get blown out. So in a situation where the dark water is in the background a little bit, I'm going to intentionally underexpose it. This might have even been 1.5 to 2 stops underexposed. And if you have to brighten it up a little bit after, that's better than having to try to darken areas that are blown out, which is near impossible. So sometimes I'll overcompensate a little bit, and you can see that there are details in the feathers behind the eye and on the face and neck where if I didn't compensate, it would be too blown out white and you would not see any feather detail there. And so the same thing kind of holds true with ducks like a bufflehead or this razorbill you see down below. They can be really, really tricky. And here's where a situation where I might underexpose it a little bit so that white isn't blown out, but in Lightroom, I may have to choose the shadow area or the dark areas and try to give that a little bit more exposure. Nice thing about Lightroom, you can isolate the blacks or the shadow areas and adjust the exposure within that part of the bird only. So I have to do that a lot with a bird like this because it's just tricky. When you're outside and you're looking at a black and white bird swimming around in the water, your eyeballs have way better dynamic range than what your camera's going to pull off. You know, you look at a photo sometimes and think of that example I said earlier of a bird sitting up on a wire. You're seeing that the details of that bird fine. And sometimes when you look at the photo, you're like, wow, it's like total shadow. I really can't make anything out of it. You know, you're not seeing it that way. You're actually seeing the details within it. You have better dynamic range. So you have to compensate for that sometimes in post-processing. And, you know, if you experiment a little bit in practice, you know, you could pull them off. Haven't talked about shutter speed too much. A lot of the shutter speeds that I use for general bird photography, perching birds, songbirds, you know, a shorebird that maybe isn't running around too much. I'll shoot, depending on the lighting conditions, I'll go for, you know, 800th of a second, 1000th of a second on a bright day. Rarely will I go higher than that unless I think the possibility of a flying bird is coming around. Excuse me. So I was at Great Sippawisset Marsh, and there was a couple of willets just zooming all around. I was there to try to photograph salt marsh sparrows, which are just really difficult to photograph. So my settings were a little bit different, but when I saw this willet that kept flying back and forth, I'm like, all right, I want to try to get a sharp image of this bird flying. I don't do a lot of flight photography shots because I just don't, you know, go to like a lot of hawk watches, shooting them in flight and things like that. It's more, you know, I'm a big fan of the songbirds and the warblers and those sort of things. But so I said it, it was probably 1/1600 of a second or 1/2000th of a second, somewhere in that neighborhood. And I may have edged down my aperture a little bit to try to keep that ISO at a nice level to be able to crop in after. And another thing that I do with my particular camera, it has two modes on the lens, I should say. It has an sort of an action mode for flight birds. So I put it to what's called sport mode on my lens. So when you're panning with following a bird with your lens, somehow it just stabilizes it better than the typical image stabilization I use for perching birds. So those were a couple of changes I made, and I didn't get a lot of good flight ones, but this was one of the better ones I pulled off that day. And this is some of the considerations you need to make. Again, not one setting is going to cover it for all types of bird photography, whether it's the background, the lighting, the motion. There's a lot of different things to consider. So this is what I was trying to photograph that day. And a couple of things to talk about here. First of all, salt marsh sparrows are just fun little birds. They're declining drastically across their range, but we're lucky to have them nesting here in a few places in Falmouth. So I talked about, you know, the image stabilization. It's a really neat feature that the lens has. And it's pretty common these days. A lot of different lenses have it. Canon calls it image stabilizer, and Nikon has a different term for it. They all have sort of different terms for them, but they do the same thing. Effectively, I can handhold this shot at least 4 stops slower than I could normally. It easily 3 and sometimes more. What that means is, if you're holding a 500mm lens on the sort of camera body I have, which is called a crop sensor, the rule of thumb is you want to be able to at least get that shutter speed around 500th or 750th of a second. But with the image stabilizer on, it kind of locks the image there and stabilizes it for a moment. I can probably get away with taking this shot at 2/50th of a second. So it opens up kind of a world of opportunity for you where you don't have to drive up the ISO so high in order to pull off a fast shutter speed. So you can have a lot of crop power, and this one was cropped significantly. But the other thing here is I was not using autofocus. There was just too many grasses blowing around in the way. So I switched my hand right to the barrel of the lens without having to do any switches, and I can focus just on the bird manually rather than trying to lock it on with the lens in autofocus mode. I'll try to touch on this a little bit. So another feature I use on my camera is called back button autofocus. So you have the focus, the shutter release up top. Without that, using that back button focus, you focus and release the shutter with the same button that your little index finger pushes down on. You push down partly to focus and you push all the way to take the picture. I don't like using that because this is a good situation where it would not have worked very well if I'm trying to manually focus on it. Because if I'm trying to manually focus and I just push down the shutter when I'm ready to go, it's going to take the photo without properly, boy, this is hard to explain. It allows me to meter the bird properly by pushing down slightly on the bird, but I can focus separately with the button. It allows, if I was going to use image stabilization, pushing down on that shutter release button activates the image stabilization, but it's not going to try to focus it on me. If I want to try to focus it, I use a separate button for that. And if I'm manually focusing, I can both get the image stabilizer activated and focus manually and then take the picture. Boy, I'm sorry, that was crazy. I don't know if I explained that well, but anyway, back button focus is your friend, and it takes a little getting used to, but it works. Geez, it's so touchy. I apologize. I haven't figured out how to advance the slideshow with my keys on my computer. I don't know why the arrows don't work. Okay, Northern Harrier. This guy was cruising over by South Cape Beach. So one of the challenges that you have sometimes, this bird, I'm like, what's it going to do? Is it going to fly above the horizon or below the horizon? And that made all the difference in the world for me, because I wanted to try to maximize, what I was going to get out of this. Northern Harriers fly pretty low, and I was banking that it was going to stay below the horizon, and it did. So that worked out nice for me. I didn't have to do a lot of exposure compensation for being up against a bright sky. So I made sure my shutter speed was sufficient. And with a Harrier, something like 12/50th of a second works out well. You don't have to go up to like 2000th really, because it's not like the steady flapping bird. If you're panning with it, it's soaring. Within that image, its wings aren't flapping all over the place, and there's not a lot of moving as you're following the bird. So you can get away with slower shutter speeds on flight shots with something like this. So those are the sort of considerations that I take into account when I'm photographing a bird like this. And I actually thought about, is it going to be above the horizon or below the horizon with my settings? You might say I overthink photography a lot, and perhaps I do. But I'm sorry, I'm trying to. All right, I figured out how to do it. So this one is a little unusual. I talked about where my aperture usually is. So if I can get away with an f8 aperture, if I'm fairly close to a bird, I'll do it, because it can allow for, again, if it's looking head on at me, the bill and eyes in focus. If I'm fairly close to a warbler and I'm shooting at f5.6, I'm not going to be able to pull that off. There are going to be parts of the bird out of focus because the depth isn't deep enough with 5.6. So f8 is kind of usually my optimal one. But this situation was so close to me. I'm sitting in my car. This is a black-headed gull, and they're fairly rare on Cape Cod. I've only seen a few since I've been here over the years. And this was sitting on a rail in a parking lot, and I simply rolled down my window, and I'm like, wow, this thing is like right in my face. So I didn't even zoom in all the way. If you zoom out all the way, you're going to change that depth of field. I forget what the focal length was, but at 500 millimeters, the depth of field is more shallow than at 300 millimeters. So I did a couple of different things here. Because it was such in my face, I wanted to make sure the tip of the bill was in focus, and even behind the eye was in focus a little bit. I wanted that detail. So I actually changed it to f11, which isn't what I usually do for bird photography, but it was right in my face, and I knew it was going to be difficult to get good depth of field. So f11, and I didn't shoot it at 500. I cropped in a little bit after. I knew it was bright. There was a lot of, use your crop power sometimes. So this is something that you're not going to read about a whole lot, but this applies with photographing butterflies and different things like that. I see photographs of dragonflies. They're nice, but you'll know exactly where the focus point is. If it's on the wing that's closer to you, the other wing isn't going to be in focus. But one trick to do is use the sort of principles to your advantage. Number one, use a higher number for your f-stop or a smaller opening to get more depth, but also back off. You think that you're going to get super close, it's the best way to go, but you're going to shrink that depth of field so drastically by getting that close. So take a step back and then crop in after the fact. If the light is good, you're going to be able to crop in more without any noticeable difference whatsoever. But the depth of field on that insect, butterfly, or dragonfly, or whatever, you'll have much more clarity and sharpness throughout the image than trying to stick your macro lens right up against it and photograph it. It can be frustrating when you only see a small part of it sharp. But that's kind of what I did here. f11 right out my car window, and I lowered my shutter speed as low as I could possibly go. And I was able to crop in nice and tight and get a sharp image. This is one of my favorite warbler shots, just the whole thing, the experience, and just how it ended up. I was hiking around Angel Mirror Pond, and there were two ovenbirds. That's the little pond to the west of Long Pond Woods over there in Falmouth. And they were chasing each other. They're twittering all over the place. And I was moving really slow. And one tactic I had, it seems to work. I try to let them get used to me. They'll fly around. Sometimes they'll seem a little antsy, and I just move really slow. So they were going about their business, and they started coming closer to me. They were feeding and chasing each other. I got down on the ground and I sat really, really low, scrunched down. And there was this one rock they were walking behind, and I kept waiting for them to kind of come up and take a peek. And I made a little squeak sound to see if it was curious, nothing to distract it or alarm it. And sure enough, it hopped up on the rock and it was just staring at me for like 20 seconds. And it was just this photo shoot. And, taking your time, moving slowly, moving quietly, being patient is a big part of bird photography for sure. Being prepared to kind of catch an action shot. It's always exciting when you get a bird actually doing its thing, like this green heron grabbing this frog that's almost completely a frog, but it actually has it by its tadpole tail in this photo here. So I was with my buddy Kevin Friel. He took me out onto this pond that he had some private access, and we were floating around on a boat, a small little boat. And this one just put on a show for us. I mean, it was catching dragonflies, it was catching frogs. Something about being in a kayak or a small boat, you can really put yourself in great position. You seem to be part of the landscape to them, and they're less scared. Same thing with a car. You may have noticed this before. You can pull up to a back road somewhere and see all these birds feeding in the brush and in the bushes nearby. You roll down your window, they're just going to keep going. It's like you're in a floating blind in a boat, and same thing in a car. They really go about their business. Once you open that car door and you step out, forget it. They're all going to scatter and you're not going to see them. So kind of the same principle in kayaks and boats. They feel somewhat comfortable when you're sitting there. I made sure there's a lot of things going on technically with this photo. The background was kind of dark. There was a lot of light on the bird. One of the things I had to do in post-processing was drop the highlights because there was a lot of glare on the rock that was really distracting. So there was a couple little tweaks like that. In order to bring out the proper exposure in the bird, it meant that the rock was also going to brighten up as well. And some of that area was too bright. So I fixed that a little bit. But other than that, it was about nailing the exposure the first time around. So there wasn't a whole lot to do, and I was able to get a lot of sharpness and detail with it. Also, just kind of being prepared to where you think they're going to show up. And I remember this well because I took this little path down to Coonamessett Pond by the golf course there, where it kind of goes up to I'd say the northeast part of Coonamessett Pond, maybe. Well, anyway, I'm taking this path down there, and there was a whole bunch of birds kind of flitting around behind this dense bush. And I heard the Carolina wren, always vocal, and I did a little pishing sound. And there were just a few places, if it perched in the open, I knew where it would be. So I always try to sort of be prepared if I can. It's not always going to happen that way, but when I'm walking into this area, who knows, maybe the last thing I photographed was a hawk soaring on the horizon. I don't want my lens to have to hunt for something. I want it to already be pretty close. So I focus on some of the branches nearby that I think it's going to pop up. I might even take a test picture of that bark to see if it's going to be too blown out, if I need to do any exposure compensation. I do stuff like that all the time because, again, I want to try to nail that exposure. I want to be ready for that shot. And those are some of the ways I approach photography. Same thing happened here. There were several kinglets all over the place. And there was a bush in front of me that it was a sapling, really, a small little maple tree. And I thought, well, if it's going to come out in the open, hopefully it's going to be right in this area because they do not sit still for long at all. And they're very difficult to get photos of. So this golden crown kinglet came in there. I was already pretty much focused on that spot, and it sat there for a few seconds actually, and I was able to pull it off. What was really nice about it, and I try to get this in bird photos if I can, is the clean background. it's the so-called out of focus area, the quality of the out of focus area you might hear referred to as bokeh. And if there's nothing right behind that branch and it's a good distance behind it, it gets nice and creamy and just the bird isolates and pops. And I really strive for a lot of those photos. That photo of the prairie warbler we saw at the very beginning of the show here, that was a good example of a nice clean background with zero distraction whatsoever. And I'm going to show you a shot a little bit later where I go out of my way to sort of make that happen. So being prepared, some of you have seen these photos, but I never really talked about them in terms of photography. It was a cool moment. This was a kiting bird that was sitting in the wind over by Knobscot Point, looking for things to grab. And I just got this crazy photo that went sort of semi-viral on Facebook, kind of went around the world even, of the praying mantis it had, and dropping it. And actually, I lucked out. I didn't know what it had when I took the photo, but I knew it had something, and I was very actively hunting, and I made sure I was using a shutter speed of at least 2,000th of a second. So I wanted to capture whatever it was doing, whether it was throwing its talons forward before it dropped on something, whether it was flapping, trying to, get sort of into position in the wind. So that shutter speed helped capture and freeze the moment of that praying mantis dropping. And usually the light was pretty good. In this case, it was off to my right a little bit. You could see the light hitting the top of the head. So there's a little diffuse light hitting the underside of the bird. So the only processing I had to do here in Lightroom was go to that shadow function. So anything that's a little darker in shadows, it just brightens it up a little bit. So if you're pretty close to nailing the exposure, you're not going to lose any quality by just brightening up that area a little bit. Those are really the only sort of adjustments I make, sort of lighting adjustments. I'm not a big sort of like add fake sunsets and eliminate things or, get rid of branches in the photo. I don't do that stuff. Nothing against people who do, but it takes away from what I like, it just takes away from it a little bit. I prefer just trying to make the most out of the situation I'm looking at. So this, not too much to talk about here, other than I remember what I did with this photo. I was nowhere near getting a good photo. It was a pretty bright day. You could see with the sun behind me, just kind of hitting all that wet sandbar there. It's really bright background reflecting the sky. So I was in a position where there was a few of these just hanging out. This is a short-billed dowitcher, by the way. And everything was in shadows or side lit or backlit. So I carefully just took my time, and I'm basically lying in that mud that you see from my toes all the way up to my chest and my elbows in the mud taking this photo. But I took my time, I got in position, I didn't spook it, and I was able to get some nice clear shots of it in good light. So sometimes it's a matter of putting yourself in position. Yeah, I could have taken some other shots of it and said, okay, that's good for eBird. That's a long-billed dowitcher. Sure, could have increased the shadows to see more detail. But if I was on the other side of this bird and took a picture, the shadows would be pretty harsh. And pulling those details out, you could have got some out, but you would not see the details like you see here. So you want to get to where you can get good light and not have to manipulate it that much. So that's what I did with this shot. And again, with that perspective, this was over at Black Beach where the tide is coming out of the marsh there. It's a little sandbar there. And I actually got my butt in the water here, and the camera's kind of propped between my knees. And I just sat still. They something about this spot they loved. And shorebirds can do that. They can be a blast to photograph because they'll go running right by you sometimes. But I just decided to sit there, and this one came in the water and was just bathing and shaking himself in the water. And it was just a lot of fun to watch. And something about that perspective just makes the photo better for me. If I was standing up and took the picture, I guess it would have been kind of cool, but to be able to get that perspective, to me, makes all the difference with a decent bird photo. Same thing here. A lot of you have seen this photo before. I think I've added it in a couple of, this is a baby killdeer that was running around Crane. But perspective was really important for a couple of things, not only for the sort of look that you get here, there's nothing like an eye level shot, but if I was even up on my knees taking this picture, there's something that would be different in this photo. I would, not only would I be up higher at an angle, but that out of focus area, look at how narrow it is here. You know, just a couple of, a little small stone behind the bird, you start losing the focus, and then you have that beautiful creamy background. If I was up on my knees, that sort of cone would stretch further back, and there would be more rocks in focus behind it because that angle would extend behind the bird. And it just wouldn't have the same effect. So I really kind of, by getting low, made the background practically disappear with that perspective. And it just makes the bird in the image pop a little bit more. So with red-breasted nuthatches, they always have this sort of classic pose, and it kept landing on these trees. This was out in Provincetown in the sand dunes, walking around, checking out some things. And this was one of my favorites for this particular species. I wasn't sure how it would come out, but I took a couple of shots of these trees with my camera first, some test shots. I'm like, all right, that's too backlit. And then I overexposed it a little bit. Okay, that's too bright. I didn't want to wash out the white areas. So I did that with a couple of trees in the area because I knew I might be able to get one to come in. I did a little pish and sound, and he came in to take a peek at me. Now the end result isn't quite what you see. You see the sun is behind me and above me. So it's probably close to midday. So you can see where the shadow is in the underbelly only. So a lot of cameras will take the picture and nail that exposure fine. But again, your eyes see in better dynamic range. The end result was that belly being a little too dark, that whole shadow area from the chin all the way to the belly. So I don't want it to look unnatural. All I did was tweak the shadow area in Lightroom up a little bit, just so you see the details, you see the color a little bit. It still looks like a shadow, it's still natural looking. And to me, it's more of what your eyes would see. That's always my goal, to try to make it sort of natural looking. And just a fun little bird, I love them. This is a rarity that I went to go chase in Rhode Island, a Western kingbird. I say rare, but they seem to show up every fall somewhere now, but there's usually only a few around. There was one in Falmouth right around the same time as this bird. So it's 2 falls ago. And the background was very dark, as you could see, but the sun was on the bird. So the danger is, if you're going to not make any adjustments and take this photo, see that little white area behind the bill and where the sun is hitting the feathers below the shoulder, and some of the white highlights on the wing edging could really be too white and kind of like this gleaming sort of white, and you try to drop the highlights a little bit, it's going to be too blown out. So this is another good example where I intentionally underexposed it, so it didn't try to brighten up that predominantly dark background. I wanted to keep that dark background just the way I saw it, but I wanted the bird to be there. So this bird, so that was what I did for this shot. So drastically different situation for the next shot. The bird ended up flying on some telephone lines that ran along this farm. And my goal was to get some flight shots. And man, it took me forever to get in. This was really the only acceptable flight shot that I ended up getting. It was sitting on the wire. I had it, I think 2,000th of a second. And I use a different button to focus for flight shots, which is kind of, some pro cameras have these other functions where if I hit this other button behind my camera, there's a much larger array of focus points that can pick up the focus anywhere in that scene. So that's what I was ready to do with this bird, with a faster shutter speed. And the exposure, I didn't have to do anything with because the light was behind me and it nailed it just right. So finally it took off from the wire to go down for some food, and I just followed it and I got a couple, but this was probably the better one. It's an unusual sort of flight shot, and just makes it kind of fun for me, not just a typical, he's going in for the kill and he's kind of turning his head, taking a look at me, it seems. Now, Peregrine falcon was cruising around down in Little Compton one day when I was looking for some shorebirds. And here's a situation where, you know, on a sunny day, it's always going to be a little tricky. And I got a bunch of shots of this, but it was difficult for me, for whatever reason, to get the right shot. I kept trying to get the sun on the face of the bird, and eventually I did. The trade-off is, on a sunny day like that, if you're looking up at a bird, the underwings are going to be in shadows, but there's enough detail there to see. To me, it looks natural, so I'm okay with it. And the important part, your eyes are drawn to that face, that fierce face of theirs, because that's where the exposure is nice because the sun's hitting it. And with a peregrine falcon, you really want to make sure you have a proper shutter speed to stop that action, because boy, they can really zip around. This is a sort of a fun one. I like this one. I was pretty low on the beach. First of all, you can see with the perspective. This was South Cape Beach. The problem with South Cape Beach, if you're shooting birds on the water, it's pretty much always going to be side lit or backlit. You're never going to have the light behind you at South Cape Beach. And this red-throated loon kept diving. So one tactic I do with loons and diving ducks, it goes under, I go closer. It goes under, I go closer. And that's what I did with this one. And if somebody was watching me, I would have looked like a fool. I'm sitting up by the edge of the boardwalk at Dove, and I'm like stumbling and running through the sand, trying to hold my camera up in the air so I don't drop it. And then I drop down to the sand. And then he pops up further down. I'm like, ah, man, he goes under, and I go running down the beach, and I drop in the sand. And I was getting frustrated because the side lit, I kept getting shots like you see on the back of the bird, but I kept hoping he was going to turn his head around to catch that side light enough hit in the face, and he did. It doesn't bother me one bit that the back is in shadow, because the face just jumps out of the picture in this photo, and I was really happy how that came out. And it was the only one out of probably like 40 pictures, and that's the way it is with bird photography sometimes. It's what I kept going for. I was patient, and he turned his head just right for me, and I was able to get it. I'm going to speed it up here a little bit. I try to keep it around an hour or so. Sometimes, like I mentioned earlier, it's not always about just the bird filling the frame. And I just love this whole scene behind it, and I did my best to capture it. It was warm light. There was a little bit of sort of haze in the air, and that really contributed to the background focus look to it. But you could see on the plane of the bird, it's all nice and sharp. And it's not normally where I would place a bird in a photo, but for me, it was about the complete scene. It was a nice sort of environmental shot, if you will. And I didn't have to really do a whole lot with trying to compensate for anything. It was a nice even light, but just a little composition note, something I saw that I wanted to get. I didn't have any interest in trying to zoom in any tighter on that bird. That's basically what I was going for. Sometimes you see a shot. And here's another sort of different one. I was in P-Town, and this eider caught my eye swinging around under the docks. And I took a couple of test shots. I knew it would kind of get where I wanted to eventually. I basically wanted the reflections of the pillars holding up the pier to be nice and shadowy. I didn't want it bright, trying to get what's in improper exposure where those reflections are. So you see this nice golden tone with a darker exposure and the silhouette of the bird kind of coming into the light. And I mean, maybe not the best shot in the world, but those are the sort of things I think about when I do get a little artsy with it. I like to sort of the golden ripples in it. I intentionally wanted it silhouetted with that sharp contrast of the highlights in the water, and kind of a fun shot. This is another one of my favorite warbler shots. It's not about the bird filling the whole frame. Something about this was down in Rhode Island, and the Usnea lichen that's draping all over the branches, the small leaves starting to pop out. And these branches didn't have any branches close by behind it. So just so much came into play here. The light was behind me. And when I took this photo, the bird was centered. But I knew I was going to have some possibilities here for post kind of composition stuff with the cropping, because this is cropped in a fair amount. So I just wanted to make sure the highest quality, generally speaking, is in the center part of the camera. So I just focused on that bird, snapping away whenever I could. But then after the fact, I cropped it where I just sort of sat it up and sort of towards that right-hand corner, because to me, it worked well with all the branches that you see. And with the bokeh sort of creamy in the background, it just sort of all came together. It reminded me of one of those old Japanese bird prints in a way. That's what came to my mind anyhow. So this is a ruddy turnstone, and this was at Woodneck Beach. There were a whole bunch of them feeding in the mud and on the rocks, and that didn't interest me. Sometimes, I don't know, it can be good if you could get a close-up of one, and they're all running around, and it was dark rocks and dark seaweed, and then some of the water would be bright, reflecting white where the water was breaking and stuff. And I'm like, come on, just one hop up on the rock for me. I just sat there and waited for him to hop up on the rock. And with that background, with nothing right behind it except water in the distance because of that low perspective. It was just this super creamy blue color in the background with the bird with beautiful light on it. Even the rock, the colors in the rock and the details in the rock. I just liked how it all kind of came together. I don't always kind of get excited over some shorebird shots, but this one, I liked how it ended up. Just makes it more fun too when you put a little effort into it and it turns out the way you hope. This is an example of using some topaz. And remember I talked about the bird, the harrier that was flying below the horizon instead of above the horizon? Well, I was photographing osprey above the horizon, and you'll see an example of that. But this one came cruising by me out of nowhere. I didn't even see him coming carrying the fish. So I snapped away. My shutter speeds were fine because I was working on taking photos of birds hovering. But the problem was, it was really meant for a bright sky. So when it flew down to this dark area, it was kind of washed out looking. It was a high ISO and it got grainy. So on the right is what it looked like after I worked on it with topaz a little bit. I got rid of the grain, cleaned it up a little bit, and maintained the sharpness. And that's the end result. What I was kind of hoping for was getting all those water droplets in the air trailing behind the fish. So these are the sort of things that excite me. Again, I could talk about photography for hours. I really can, and it was difficult. So this is the sort of shots I was going for. Got this fish in the talons, and you can see they always orient it head first, and enough light to kind of get the underside. I might have tweaked the shadows up a little bit, but that's basically what I was going for that day. Just composition note here. This was, I only got a couple more. This was a American goldfinch feeding on some thistle in my yard. So I like the negative space around it. I try to somewhat think of thirds sometimes when you hear in photography. It doesn't always work with birds. It depends on what's going on in the scene, the subject matter, things around it. But in my mind, I sort of like the thistle coming out from the corner and then the bird coming into the view. I couldn't shift it more to the right, the bird, because its tail would be too close to the edge. That's not something I mentioned earlier, but it personally, I get anxious when I see a great bird photo, except the tail or a wing is right up against the edge of the photo. I'm like, I want to go in there and fix it, but it's not my photo, so I'm not going to say anything. And sometimes you'll even see a picture of a hawk or something, and the bottom of the tail is cut off, but it has great detail. It's like, if they only would have, like, I want to see the whole bird in the photo usually. So that's kind of what I was going for here. The negative space around it with the clean background, because nothing was close, worked out nicely. So here's an unusual position. I don't usually put a bird down in this position, but for me, it was about the whole scene, the plant. I wanted to get some of the color of the flower in there, and I wanted to pretty much come in a line across the photo. So this was post sort of cropping. The original crop was similar, but I tweaked it a little bit and cropped in to sort of keep it clean underneath it and around the side, where it just kind of came down from the top and with the bird being on the bottom. And just fun working on photos like that. I do get artsy a little bit once in a while looking at the photos, but again, it's usually just about the bird itself. This was a recent exciting one for me. Some of you on the bird forums might have seen this. This is a prothonotary warbler I got lucky with down at South Cape Beach. And the entire time I'm following this bird, there were a couple of things I had in mind. It was a really dark day. When I first got there, the first shots I got were horrible. I didn't really have my camera set how I should have. It ended up feeding along this road, and I just stayed across the street. And I underexposed one full stop for everything, because it was usually against dark leaves or dark branches and dark tree, the ground was dark, it was feeding low. So believe it or not, something like that bright yellow can end up being, even color can be washed out. It can be so bright where you lose detail completely. So I intentionally underexposed the full stop, and I just kept following this bird from across the street, and it just kept doing its thing like I wasn't there, and ended up working out nice. And I got a few keepers out of it anyhow. Well, that's all I got here for today. I thank you. There's my email if anybody has any bird questions or photography questions or whatever, places, you name it. Happy to help out in any way. And let's see. So Lucy, if you want to chime in, I wasn't watching the chat box. I don't know if anybody typed in any questions or if anybody has any questions for me. I'd be happy to answer them.
I think we're all just so mesmerized by your glorious photos that we just are.
That's a nice
speechless.
way of you saying I put them to sleep.
No, 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 no. Oh my gosh. I don't have any questions. I mean, technically, you're way over my head, but I think I did learn something. Actually, John has a question. Do you use handheld all the time?
I do. I just, because of the style of photography I do, I use this sort of shoulder strap setup that the strap attaches to the bottom of my lens, the tripod collar, because it's not good to have a lens that heavy, just full weight hanging off the camera body. And that's the beauty of the vibration reduction. You can get away with not using a tripod a lot. And I mean, I use tripod for scenic photography, for macro stuff, a lot of other things, but the style of bird photography I do, I'm always on the move, and having a big lens and a tripod with me everywhere just wouldn't work out well for me. But well, thank you,
Well,
everybody.
Yeah, the other were just comments, very nice. Thanks, some great shots, of course. Thank you, Mike. I want to see even more of your fabulous photos. Inspiring. Thank you. I agree with all those comments. Oh, here's one. Wait. Awesome, Mike. I'll be sharing the YouTube link with my photography community, says Sandy. So that's great.
Oh,
Thanks,
cool.
Sandy. That's
Yeah,
fabulous.
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, this will be on our YouTube channel along with all the other talks that we've recorded over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I have a
So-
YouTube channel myself.
Oh, you do?
And yeah, it's called Mike's Nature Connection. So I do a lot of different nature videos. I'm going to start doing more photography stuff. I don't have a lot of that, a little bit, but not any technical stuff with photography. But I mean, not just bird, I do bird stuff. I do kayaking, well, different things like that. But anyhow, yeah. So check that out if you're interested.
Hi, Mike.
Hello, who's that? I hear you, but I don't see you.
I was in a class and I have this big patch on my eye. So just a second, let me pick up my iPad. Dropped.
Sure. You got a question?
I'm not sure.
Oh, there's
who's
the link.
talking.
Very good.
Yeah, there's the link. Is that that's your channel?
No, I don't think so.
That may be ours. That may be the 300 committee one. Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
link for this thing that just aired.
Oh, yeah, good.
Oh,
good.
great. Just
Thank you.
directly to the YouTube. Great. Fabulous. Okay.
That's great.
Super.
Yeah, so
Thanks,
if you
Sandy.
go to the 300 committee website, on the bottom of the page, you'll see the YouTube little icon. You click on that, you'll see all the videos that the 300 committee has live streamed and put up. So there's a variety of talks there you can check out.
Big wide variety. Yep. Okay.
You're welcome. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so
I
much,
hope I
Mike.
didn't get too
Thanks,
technical.
everybody.
But yeah, it can be a little head spinning sometimes with some of the stuff I talked about. But just to give you an idea that it's basically these things come into play, and it's my objective wasn't really to teach all the functions, but sort of the considerations that I take, and it can be a little easier than you think once you start learning the basics of how they all work together, aperture and shutter, and what you can do with it. But thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Have a great evening.
Good night.
Good night.